Kelsey Bayliff. I'm with American Humane. And so I'm going to talk to you guys today about auditing and certifying animal welfare in poultry. So I just wanted to give kind of a brief background about American Humane because we really commonly get mixed up with other organizations. And so I just wanted to clear the floor of who we are so everyone is aware. So American Humane is an animal welfare nonprofit organization. And so we are committed to ensuring the safety, welfare, and well-being of animals. And we've been doing this for more than 140 years. And, we've been promoting animal welfare and safety of animals and promoting the animal-human bond for a very long time, focused on all different types of animals. We have kind of a two-prong within our group. And so we have a cause mission group that's focused more on rescue and military. And then we also have a certification umbrella where we certify animal welfare for Hollywood. So if you've ever seen entertainment that has no animals were harmed, that's us. We have a pet provider program, a humane certified conservation program, humane tourism, and then our farm program, which is what I'm going to be talking with you guys about, or that's the program I'm associated with. And so our American Humane Farm program, this is really what our program was, American Humane was founded on farm animal welfare. And we've continued our dedication to farm animal welfare to this day. We were the first third-party audit and certification program in the United States for humane treatment of farm animals or animals that are used for food. And again, we are committed to farmers and committed to excellent animal welfare, exceeding industry standards, and providing independent third-party verification of animal welfare. And I did want to mention, I know obviously this is a poultry-focused group, and so we have a lot of poultry standards and programs that we work with. And so, of course, we've got a broiler chickens program. We certify cage-free laying hens, free-range and pasture laying hens. We also certify hatcheries, including chicks, poults, and ducklings. We work with turkeys, and then we also have a ducks program that looks at meat and egg-laying ducks. So just wanted to outline those so everyone knows that they're available as well. And that's, kind of the work that we do. So really, to talk about certifying animal welfare, I think we need to talk first about what is animal welfare. And I know that we've talked a lot about this topic today, so I'm going to try not to be too repetitive for anything that anyone else has already talked about. There's different places that we can find definitions of animal welfare. And so I think the one that we really commonly think about, or one that we commonly cite, is going to be from the American Veterinary Medical Association. And so this kind of ties in really closely with what Dr. Blatchford was talking about, as far as, animal welfare really is representative of the state of the animal and is a measure of how the animal is coping with the conditions that it's in. And so this is a individual measure that's really telling us how the animal is, doing within its own environment, which is a very, philosophical way of talking about animal welfare. The AVMA also has kind of a guide of what does that actually look like? And so when we think about an animal that has good animal welfare, what does that look like? And so we're thinking about an animal that's healthy, comfortable, well-nourished, safe, able to express innate behaviors, and generally not suffering from unpleasant states, things like pain or distress. They've also outlined some kind of what does this look like and how do we attain a good animal welfare state. And so, thinking about an animal that's healthy, things that are going into that would be preventative healthcare as well as veterinary care. So we're trying to, inhibit poor injury or disease or anything like that from occurring. But if it does occur, we want veterinary care to make sure they're taken care of. We want appropriate shelter to make sure our animals are feeling safe and that they are in an environment that's comfortable to them. We need good management and good nutrition to make sure that they're well nourished, that they're hydrated. Humane handling is also a big part of this, that we want to make sure that, especially for our birds, that they're not experiencing distress or any sort of negative state related to handling. And then something that really commonly gets overlooked is humane slaughter as well. It's really common that we just think about the birds in this state, which it makes sense because it's a longer state for them, but we want to make sure their entire life is a humane experience and in a positive welfare state. So we also want humane slaughter all the way through their life. So when we talk about animal welfare, it's also really common that we talk about the 5 freedoms model. And so this was developed in the early to mid 90s. And so basically this was developed as a checklist to assess the strengths and weaknesses of husbandry systems. And so the 5 freedoms, I think, again, get a lot of attention. There's a lot of conversation about them: the freedom from thirst, hunger, malnutrition, the freedom from discomfort and exposure, from pain, injury, and disease, from fear and distress, and then to express normal behaviors. And kind of hand in hand with these are the 5 provisions. And so things that we are going to do to try to meet these freedoms. And so we want them to be free of thirst and hunger. And so in order to do that, we're going to provide them with readily available, fresh food and water that's going to help them to maintain health and vigor, right? So kind of going hand in hand. There was some criticism, or historically, there's been some criticism of this, that these are ideal states rather than acceptable welfare standards, because in theory, is an animal truly completely free from all of these at all times? And so there's been there's been some groups that have kind of taken advantage of some of the language that's used around the 5 freedoms. And so that has also kind of shifted towards the 5 domains model, which was developed around a similar time. And these are really looking at, and it's very similar, but looking at a physical or functional disruption or imbalance at that level, looking at how restrictions on behavioral expression can then have negative effects on the overall mental state of the animal. And so we're looking again at the overall physical, behavioral health of that animal, and how does that affect the mental domain or the animal welfare piece that's going to tell us how that animal is doing in its environment. So again, we have the nutrition piece of, do they have enough food and water? Are they deprived of food? Are they deprived of water? If they are, that would lead to the mental domain of thirst or hunger, which is going to tell us kind of how they are in that mental state. The 5 domains has been updated a handful of times. And so I just wanted to touch on one of the updates, really broke this out into positive and negative affective states. And so again, we've got our physical functional domains broken out into negative and positive. And so for nutrition example, the negative would be restricted food and water. The positive would be having enough food and water, right? And then those again are going to affect our mental state, where we have negative experiences, something like thirst or hunger, and then versus a positive experience of, the drinking pleasures, taste pleasures, being satiated, chewing, all of those types of feelings. So that's kind of how we think about animal welfare, or how we would define it. But we're also talking about certifying animal welfare. So why do we want to certify animal welfare? Why is it important? Why do we do what we do? So there's kind of 2 big reasons that we look at certifying animal welfare. And so one of the big ones is as a response to criticism of husbandry. So there has been some sort of concern raised by the public or by consumers that tells us, we are concerned about animal welfare and we want more information. There is consumer demand, and there is an asking that they want to buy products that are from animals that have been raised in a good animal welfare or a humane condition. I've got some graphs here from a study that was published in 2019 showing that the overwhelming majority of consumers here are concerned with animal welfare, and they're also willing to pay more for a product that is labeled good animal welfare, that comes from animals that are raised in that way. So people have this concern, and there's a huge disconnect from the consumer or the public with agriculture, and so they want to know that their product is raised this way, or their animals were raised this way. They don't necessarily know how do I know that they are? So we certify to show them, yeah, this is an animal that was raised in this way, meeting humane standards or positive animal welfare, based on these written out programs that we have, and this is a label that shows us that this is a product that meets what you're looking for. The other big reason that we certify is for management desires. And so we also know that animals that are raised humanely or in a positive welfare state are generally going to be better performing animals as well. So there are management desires to make sure that animals are raised in this way. And so we can help to ensure that their programs are working and help to guide them in building a good program that is going to be good for the animals. So from there, what are our goals of our welfare assessment? And so we want to determine that the welfare for the animals is appropriate. And so we're going to do that using a written audit tool that's going to give us a standardization across different places or different facilities that we are going to go. And that audit tool is going to be based on written standards that are developed specifically for that species. And in a lot of cases, that production system. And again, we're doing this to help assure consumers that the animals are cared for properly, and also to help with that internal verification process. So we want to be really a helping piece to make sure that everyone kind of understands how those animals are cared for, and really help to improve any programs. So all of that said, when we're talking about building a auditing program, or what does that look like? And I know we've talked about that a little bit today. We have some goals for our overall welfare assessments. And so we would like our welfare assessments to be science-based, and that's going to kind of tie hand in hand with utilizing peer-reviewed data. So the peer-reviewed process is, we have someone that collects this information, they're going to send it out for publication. That data is going to be reviewed by other experts in the field. And so we have multiple experts, multiple eyes that are looking at this information. So we want to utilize this science-based or this evidence-based data that's going to tell us, yeah, we know that this means this or this causes this, to help us use the best way to measure these. We, ideally would like to have a statistically sound sampling method, which again is a big challenge, especially in poultry, because we do have really, really large populations. And so how do we get a good sample of the animals that we are intending to certify? And so working with a statistician or, again, using data can help us to really make sure that we are doing this the best way possible. We would like to incorporate various animal welfare measures. And so both in the respect of, we can look at animal welfare from different ways, as far as we could look at different parts of the animal, but we also want to incorporate different ways to measure that, as far as looking at the animal, looking at resources, looking at records. And we want to strive for continuous improvement. And this is, so, we're never going to be in the perfect scenario where nothing could be improved. There's always going to be room for improvement. And part of that is because we're always learning more about the animal, about the environment, about the facility. And so there's always going to be opportunities for improvement. And we want to strive to continue to improve that process and continue to improve the experience for the animal. And so there's three kind of big ideas that I'm going to dive into a little bit further. So based on that, we want to build meaningful standards that are going to be really, really great and really strong for us to build our audit tool with. We would like to have integrity in the auditing process, and then we need to be accountable for the information that we're getting. So diving into building meaningful standards first, and I'm going to kind of touch on all of these a little bit more. So it sounds silly, I think, I feel like it sounds too obvious, that we want to incorporate measures that are correct, useful, and feasible. I think a lot of times we don't necessarily talk about that because it kind of goes without saying that we want them to be this, but really when we get to in the field, on the boots on the ground portion of it, it's extremely important that we consider these, because a lot of times when we're removed, we may not always be thinking like, is this the best way to do this? Is this feasible? So when we think about the actual application of these audit tools, we want to make sure our measures are going to be correct, useful, and feasible. We also want to use assessment methods that are going to evaluate different parts of the production system. So we've talked a lot today about resource-based measures. We've also talked about outcome or animal-based measures. So I'll touch a little bit on those, but we also want to look at protocols and records for those as well. Keeping in mind that the audit that we are doing is, we're going into a barn or facility or whatever it's going to be. We're going in for a snapshot of what this is, and we're seeing these birds for a very short period of time. And so what can we do to build an audit tool that is more representative of the whole picture, and trying to get as much information as we can that is not just that moment in time, right? So we want to make sure that we're thinking about that. We also want to evaluate different animal welfare concerns. And so there's different kind of pieces to animal welfare or different needs that are being met, like I kind of talked about before. So we want to make sure that we are touching on all of those aspects to get a comprehensive picture of how are those birds doing, or how is that individual doing in the environment that it's in. So just diving into this a little bit deeper, for our correct measures, we want them to meet certain criteria to be correct. And again, I think we don't always talk about it because it seems obvious that, yeah, of course they have to be correct. And of course they have to be valid and accurate. But really, what does that mean? And so we want our measures to be valid. And for that, we want them to be in measuring the intended target. And so for that, we want to that's where we're going to rely heavily on scientific data and evidence-based measures that are going to tell us, like, yes, there is a causal relationship between X and Y, or there is a, some sort of correlation or some sort of relationship between X and Y, that this measure is related to what we are trying to understand. We know that this measure is related to the intended target, rather than just kind of guessing games of, we're going to measure this because we think it could be related to this. We want to rely on that science that tells us, yeah, these two things are related. We also want our measures to be accurate. And so, we want them to be close to whatever the actual values would be. And we want to be able to detect small changes in animal welfare. And so my example for that would be something like temperature. So I can walk in and I can identify, if I feel comfortable, I could give you a general sense of, like, it feels like it's about 50 degrees out today. That's not very accurate for what I'm looking at, right? So we do want some level of accuracy that's going to tell us what is the actual measure that we're looking at. And again, able to detect small changes. And so I can walk in and say, yeah, I feel comfortable. I don't know what the temperature is. And again, my scale for comfort is not the same as my birds. So I want measures that are going to be accurate. I also want measures that are going to be complete. And so I want to have a comprehensive assessment of the entire state. And so we want to have measures that are going to take multiple pieces and so when we combine them together, we have a really comprehensive understanding of what's going on. And then we also want measures that are going to be reliable. So we would like to have consistent results. If we were repeating those measures or looking at them over time, we'd like to have something with low variation. Again, as we're looking at those over a longer period of time. We also want our measures to be useful. And so with that, there's kind of three big ideas there. We'd like them to have a range in applicability, not, and Dr. Blatchford touched on this a little bit, not every facility looks exactly the same, right? The environment is different. The actual facility is different. The way that they're managing them is different. Things are not exactly the same cookie cutter one across the other. So we want our measures to be useful across a full range of contexts of interest and be able to be applied across different facilities. Because again, there are differences and there's not just one way to be doing this. And so we want to be able to have that range. We're also thinking about the scales here. And so there are a lot of measures that have a subjective approach. We would like to be objective as much as we can. Having a measurable criteria with a numeric score is going to be really helpful when we can. And we'd also like our measures to be informative. And so providing information about the environment, the husbandry, that really tells us what's going on. And then lastly, we want our tools to be feasible as well. I mean, I think it's, we can take all of this and we can put together this really incredible tool that, in a flock of 100 birds is super great, and we could do everything and we can look at every single thing. And, when we get, again, boots on the ground into the field, that may not necessarily be the case. It may not be feasible to do in every facility. So we want something that has some level of ease of use. We have limitations on time, money, access to animals. So we want to be able to collect and apply this information. We can also be limited on current relevant data. And I think both speakers kind of touched on that. We can be limited on what our current understanding is on how to measure things and also how to interpret. And so we want to take that into consideration when we're building this and incorporating measures as well. We may not, there may be some new information, but we don't have full verification on that. We want to keep in mind what our limitations are. I also mentioned we want to include protocols and records, resources, and outcomes. So our protocols and records would be things like standard operating procedures, overall protocols. We want to look at records related to the animal or the facility. And the good thing about these is that they're going to give us an indicator of a longer period of time. And so again, we're walking into a barn and we're getting an idea of how everything is going on that day. But looking at protocols and records, we can have a better idea of, is this being evaluated over a longer period of time? What do those evaluations look like? Again, especially when we talk about birds with kind of a quicker production cycle, we're looking at birds that are maybe one flock, but they have, a very continuous round of flocks that are coming and going. Our records are going to help us to identify, how are those animals looking over longer periods of time? And then also, do they have protocols in place that are going to be related to the measures that we're looking at? Our resources are also going to be important. And so that could include facility specifications and characteristics. It's also commonly going to include limiting resources. And so things like food and water, space is the really big one. Another one we don't always talk about is the caregivers. And so is there enough personnel to be caring for the animals and to be doing everything to upkeep their environment that is necessary? And so that's really diving into the human management aspect. And then we also want outcome-based measures. And so that could be observable measures on the animal, including, what does the animal look like? And then also quantifiable measures of the environment of, what's going on here. So just running through an example here, let's say, I'm putting together my tool, or I'm building something within my facility. I want to do some internal checks. And so I'm interested in looking at foot health for broilers. What do I need to do? What does that look like? How do I get that useful, feasible? How do I check all of those boxes here? So we can start here by looking at animal-based measures. We could, we've got a flock of birds here. We could look directly at paws, at hocks. We could look directly at the feet or the legs of the bird. We could pick up every single bird. Is that necessarily going to be feasible in every situation? Not necessarily, but we have that opportunity to look directly at the birds if we would like. We can also observe gait scoring that we know is going to be related to the health of the birds based on the science that we have that tells us there's a relationship there. To hit on that feasibility, we can also observe a subsample of the entire population. So maybe I go in and I pick up all of the blackbirds and I leave the other birds. The blackbirds being the ones I have chosen, not necessarily that they are blackbirds. And so incorporating those animal-based measures that tells us how is this animal doing in its environment? How is it currently coping with its environment? We can also look at our resources here. And so, we know that litter moisture is associated with foot health, and that's going to be a contributing factor. So we measure litter moisture to assess their litter management program. We can also measure ammonia. And that's going to tell us, we've looked at the animal, what are the resources associated with this as well? And like I said, our personnel is something that can also be overlooked here. So we also want to look at our caretaker competence and training. And so do we have enough people to be taking care of these birds? Are they trained in a litter management program? Do they know how to identify a situation where litter is not being managed appropriately? Do they know how to identify birds that are having some sort of injury or health issue? And so are the resources available to have good foot health for those birds? We can also dive into our records, right? So we're talking about broilers. So we're looking at one group of birds within a flock that's there for a fairly short period of time. And then we've got, a bunch of birds that are coming in and out of this facility. And so we can look at their records and say, have their caretakers been measuring, maybe it's paw scores, or maybe it's hawk scores or gait score, whatever it's going to be. Have they been looking at this over a longer period of time? Is this measured on every single flock? Do we know that there is a program in place that is prioritizing the health of the birds for each flock that is coming in? And so not just that, so that we're not just looking and saying, yeah, this flock, these birds look good. But we know that there's also a program that tells us that the other birds that are coming in and out are experiencing the same thing. Can we verify that with records that they're keeping? And then also do they have standard operating procedures or protocols? And so do they have protocols that tell them how to assess what they're looking at? And so are people being trained for this is how you assess it? And so we know that they're assessing it the same way every time. Is there an SOP for litter management? Are people being trained on litter management? And so can they identify if there is an issue? Can they identify, how can I approach that issue? How can I try to fix it? And so again, looking at this whole picture of, we can look at the birds today, but let's think about how do we think about the other birds that are coming in? Are the people there really are set up to provide a good environment for the birds? And again, really looking at that whole picture. And then lastly, I had kind of talked a little bit about, the different welfare measures or different types of welfare measures. And so I put it here, on the bottom, we really want to make sure that we're covering all of our basic animal needs. So we want to make sure they're not being abused, they're not being neglected, they have food and water, they're not severely ill, there's no life-threatening things going on. So at the very, very least, our birds are surviving and there's nothing threatening their life, right? The very, very most basic animal needs are being met, right? We don't want to put all of our emphasis on one thing and then ignore something that could be possibly life-threatening. We want to make sure all of that is being covered. We then move to additional needs, things like injury, disease. Are they protected? Are they comfortable? Are they in an environment that can allow them to be thriving? Because we want to make our goal is to get to there, but we need all of these building blocks to get us to that point. And then we can build up to our behavioral needs. Are they displaying innate behaviors? Do they have opportunities for environmental enrichment? Do they have an opportunity to thrive in that environment? Or are they just in a place that, they don't even have the opportunity to be thriving? So I also mentioned having integrity in the auditing process. And so there's a few ways that we think about that. And so we want to be completely clear and transparent when we are building an auditing tool and and certifying animal welfare. Because there's also a lot of moving parts with this. There's a lot of people that are associated with this. So we want to have very clear instructions to the producer as far as how do I prepare for the audit. So we want to be transparent with the standards that are being measured, so that they are set up to succeed in this situation. We also want to be clear to the auditor in how there's going to be evaluation of these measures. And that's going to be consistent sampling methods. It's also going to be training so that every auditor knows I'm going in to this facility, I am sampling based on these methods, and we have performed training with them so that these measures are reliable and repeatable over multiple facilities. So we know every producer is hopefully experiencing, to the best of our abilities, the same experience. And then we can also be transparent with our consumers that these are the measures that we are certifying. This is the experience that the animal is having. This is the experience the producer is having, and that we have full transparency in this complete system here. So when we're thinking about being transparent for the producer, we would like to work with and make sure that all of our producers are prepared for the audit. And so we would like them to be familiar with what the program looks like, what are the standards that we're looking at. And so showing them the standards or the audit tool of these are the things that we're looking at. This is what you need to be doing to succeed in the program that we have to certify animal welfare. That oftentimes will lead to a conversation with a veterinarian or a nutritionist, again, because preventative care is so important. Veterinary care, having a balanced diet, ample food and nutrition. So having a conversation with their veterinarian or nutritionist, reviewing and updating protocols with veterinarian and nutritionists, making sure that they have their available records. And then the best way to prepare is also doing a self-assessment. Go through and kind of go through the motions, check all of your boxes and say, yeah, this is something that we've been doing, or this is something that we need to do in the future. But that's going to be the best way to prepare for the certification process. And then we also want to make sure so that we are improving and offering training methods. And we have data that tells us that experience and training do affect reliability and repeatability of the measures that we're looking at. And there's a lot of different measures. I use keel bone damage here. We all use keel bone damage as an example. But this goes for if we're looking at gait scoring, if we're looking at paw scoring. Experience and training is going to affect the reliability and repeatability. The different types of training can have different, and when I say different types of training, I mean the way that the training is being offered, as well as the materials included in the training, can really affect the outcome. I know Dr. Blatchford touched a little bit, and I've got one of his papers here that we're learning more about the reliability and accuracy of heel bone damage in laying hens. But traditionally, we've always really emphasized that we need really great training for the people that are doing these. We want them to have experience in auditing or working with the animal that they're looking at. And we want the training to also be reflective of the best way to help them identify whatever it is. And so if we have, virtual training, we would like to maybe have some hands-on training in that as well. Just kind of making sure that we have a complete training program that can be really, really helpful here. And I've got an example here and a shout out to Dr. Blatchford here. This is a program that we worked with University of California, Davis with. And so I've got a link here, and this is a website that is designed to help training for laying hen welfare assessment. And so basically with this website that Dr. Blatchford really worked heavily on, there's opportunities for learning how to assess, different ways to assess animal welfare. And so part of that is, how do I choose which birds to assess? Also, for different measures, how do I evaluate those measures? And there's lots of pictures that show, maybe I want to look at eye health for a bird. And so what does a normal eye look like? What are some of the things that we could see that would be a deviation from that normal eye? And so there's, an opportunity to show the person, how do I look at all of these measures? And then there's also an opportunity to test repeatability. And so going through and looking at multiple scenarios and really looking at how repeatable are we over multiple measures. And so this is something that can be really helpful in training of our auditors, or training of yourself or your internal auditor, or however we're going to be, whoever is you doing this auditing process, making sure that they are comfortable and that we're collecting reliable, repeatable information. And then lastly, we want to have accountability within the auditing process. And so, like I mentioned, we want to strive for continuous improvement. No system is going to be perfect. And even if it was, it's not going to be perfect for long. We're always learning new information about the animals, about the facilities, about, what this overall picture looks like. And there's so many pieces that go into animal welfare that, again, we're not going to have a perfect scenario. And so there is always going to be room for improvement, and we want to be continuously pushing that improvement. To do that, we have to be able to set and define specific goals. And that may not be the same goal for every producer or every facility. But we want to be able to define what those specific goals are. So what are our areas of improvement, or areas where we can improve? And then what are realistic goals that could be met for that? In order to identify if we are reaching those goals, we have to have some sort of data that is going to be related to the audit outcomes. And so part of that could be, numerical data that tells us maybe a score or a percentage or a number or whatever it's going to be, but we need to have something that is going to help us identify if we are reaching those goals. We could look at numbers of non-compliances. We could look at specific areas of non-compliances. There's a lot of different ways that we could break this out, but the biggest thing is that we want to identify those goals for improvement, and we need to have a way to identify if we are reaching those goals. And so we want to have some sort of data or outcomes. And then, depending on who's doing that, we want to have full accountability and transparency with where we're at in that process. So in order to have that accountability, we would hopefully be using regular measures to assess their current states. And so kind of what I talked about before of having those records over time. And so if we have multiple flocks that are coming in over a year or so, are we taking these measurements on multiple flocks? Do we see a pattern over time? Trying to assess overall situations and, again, look for patterns. We want to be realistic for practical improvement and be realistic with the goals that we're setting. And so identifying what are areas that we can improve and what are realistic goals that we can set, and what is a practical way that we can get there. And then, again, understanding that improvement over time. And so I've got, for example, here, this is kind of a classic example from Temple Grandin's website as far as looking at an auditing process, and implementing an audit process during stunning to look at the beef plants that are stunning more than 95% of their animals. And so we're seeing, before implementing an auditing program, the accountability here is very low. We're not necessarily being as accurate as we want to be with that measure. As we incorporate an auditing program, as we're being accountable for those results, we're reaching this continuous improvement and doing much better over time. So we want to have this data available so that we can understand the improvement over time, set reasonable goals, and then also really, how do we make improvements? Because I think it's commonly we may have like an overall score or a pass or a fail or whatever it may be, but where are those pieces that we can improve upon and how do we do so? And that's also why it's important to have that really complete picture of this is what the overall program looks like for that animal. And so if we want to improve, where are the opportunities to do so? So just kind of as a summary, we would like our certifying and auditing process to be science-based. We want to use the most current, up-to-date, evidence-based information that's out there. We would like to have a standardized, statistically sound sampling method that is going to allow for the same experience for the auditor, the same experience for the facilities that are going through that. We want to incorporate various animal welfare measures as far as different types of welfare and then different ways of looking at welfare. And we want to strive for continuous improvement. And the best way that we can kind of go forward and use all of those is we want to build meaningful standards that utilize these ideas here. We want to have integrity in the auditing and the certifying process. And then we want to have full accountability for the auditing and certifying process, again, for ourselves, for the producers, for the auditors that are going through it, and then for the consumers that are also looking for these labels. So thank you guys so much for your time and attention today. I've got my email here. If there's any questions, thoughts, concerns, anything, please feel free to reach out to me at any point. But again, thank you guys so much.